What is the financial backing for Real News?
Okay. Real News, well, I'll give you the history of the financial backing. We started when I used to produce the main political debate show on CBC in Canada for 10 years. First show called Face Off and then Counterspin. So in the first year or two of creating what became Face Off, the financial backing was me, because I had a daily television show. So I was able to use some of our resources to hire some staff to start working on the Real News. And we started doing feasibility studies, and we started doing some funding applications. The first big chunk of funding came from three foundations: the MacArthur Foundation, Ford, and the Haas Foundation, and a few other smaller ones. This was before we went online to start developing a website. It was just supposed to pay for a feasibility plan, but we used it to get started, and because we always thought it was feasible, and we weren't ever really doing a feasibility plan, but that's the way you raise money to get started, is you claim it's a feasibility plan, because then it sounds corporate. And it sounds like you have a business head, because you don't just do it. You're trying to find out if it's feasible, but the truth is we just did it. The other thing is we always said we wanted to do uncompromising journalism. So in the fall of 2007, we started doing our stories and our journalism, and I think we did what we said we were going to do, which meant we got no more funding from the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and some of the other bigger foundations. And that was the only other time we ever got a big, major foundation grant was from the Knight Foundation about 3 years ago, and that was a technology grant. That was to help develop tools on our website. Other than that, unless I'm forgetting something, we've never had any other big foundation money. Now, it's not because we don't ask, because we would like never to take foundation money, because it can impose a kind of self-censorship pressure. But we've been able to find other funding, and as a result, we don't change what we do, and we don't change the way we speak, and thus we don't get big foundation funding. So it's not that we don't ask, they don't want to give it to us. Right now our funding is, we run out of, now the building's a separate issue, which I'll address in a second, but we run at about $900,000 to $1 million a year. Our funding now is somewhere between a third to a half small donations, so 10s and 20s and 50s, and we run online fundraising campaigns 3-4 times a year. And the other half of our funding are bigger donors, but they're all bigger donors who were viewers. And each one has its own story, his or her own story. Most of it is actually, people that are fairly ordinary people who inherited some money and have progressive or other reasons for wanting to support us, but it's content driven. And one of them is a guy who was taught music, I can't ever get the phrase right, ethnomusicology. But his father made some oil investments and left him some money, and he decided what he would do with that money is support, ventures like this. And it wasn't even a big inheritance, but because he's the one that's paid for the building and for the renovations. The building cost $1.3 million, and he's contributed another $2.4 million in renovations. Now, part of that is we hope to make some revenue, like we're going to rent this studio out. We're building a cafe in the other building, and so we hope the building becomes a new revenue stream. And this becomes a bit of a model that if we can fund this place through the revenue from the studio, the revenue from the cafe, and by making ourselves relevant to people's lives in Baltimore and elsewhere, but I think there's a particular thing, as I was saying before, about breaking through in a city, then I think this place becomes self-funding, in which case the next place we want to go is Oakland. And then after Oakland, I think we want to go to Detroit, and then we want to go maybe to a place in Canada, Hamilton, just outside of Toronto, which is an old steel town. But there is something specific about why Baltimore and why Oakland and why Detroit. And obviously the common thread there is these are either very large or majority African-American cities. And it's partly pragmatic. We bought some questions in a Zogby poll in 2005 or 2006, where we asked 2,500 people, would you donate for an independent news television network that didn't take corporate funding, and we don't take corporate funding, we don't take government funding, we don't accept or sell advertising. But that was the question on the poll. And so you could either be very likely, unlikely, or very unlikely to donate $5 or $10 a month. So the group most represented in very likely, African Americans. Region, the South. The group most represented in likely and very likely, Hispanic Americans. I mean, in the beginning, I mean, I don't know why we were surprised when we saw the numbers, because it's kind of obvious. The people that feel most disenfranchised from the media were the ones that say yes. But there's another reason why, is because I think history has shown in the United States that there is no transformative change that takes place in this country if African Americans aren't at the heart and leadership of it. So that's another reason why we're here. Because while we are journalists, and we will do the job as journalists, and we follow journalistic methodology, and if we found tomorrow some news story that made Black Agenda Report not look good, and I know we won't, but we'll do it. I mean, if we find a story that makes the real news look bad, we'll do it. I mean, we do, our role in all of this is as journalists. But it doesn't mean as individuals we're not interested in transformative change. Otherwise, we would go work in the corporate media. So, a long answer, but.
How are you coordinating or elaborating with the other news media here in Baltimore, specifically the Afro-American newspaper, which is a newspaper that's been producing since 125 years ago, and it has offices in major cities, urban cities around the country. Is there any coordination, collaboration,
not yet, but
interest?
it's definitely on our agenda. We want to talk to all the media, including even corporate media. I mean, we'll talk. I mean, specifically, we are interested in talking to the Afro, and we're looking to see in terms of Black radio. But as Glenn said, there's not a heck of a lot of Black radio news anymore. And in fact, we're just asking some African American friends, colleagues of ours, where do you get your news? Where do you get Black news? And they're kind of at a loss. I mean, I think one of them had heard of Black Agenda Report, but other than that, I mean, didn't really know. But yeah, and there's a website in town called The Brew, which does pretty good investigative stuff about municipal politics. So we want to work with them. We're working closely with, in the sense that they're going to be renting space on the second floor, and they're a source of news for us, even though they're not news organizations. But with the Baltimore Algebra Project, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Word on the Street, the newspaper for homeless people, Institute of a Black World, they're all going to be on the second floor in offices up here, which is going to give us a way. And then we're very, very serious about hiring Baltimoreans, and particularly African American Baltimoreans. If you're going to do news for the local audience is 65% Black. So we're very serious that the real news in Baltimore, at the very least, if not broader, has to be 65% Black. And because you have to know how to talk. You have to know the community, and you have to be able to speak in a grammar the community understands. We're developing a relationship with Morgan. We just met with the leaders or chairs of all the departments of Morgan's communication department, and we're developing 2 joint projects with them to start with. One is going to be a People's History of Baltimore. We're going to start a movement across the city for young people to take their cameras and interview their grandparents and their aunts and their uncles and get the history of Baltimore, like where were you in 1968? Pick some really key moments in history and get the story out from a generation, that maybe not here that much longer, and they need to tell their story. Then the second thing we're going to do is we're starting a website called Independent World Music, and a show called The Real Hip Hop, and a radio channel, internet radio channel called The Real Hip Hop. And we're starting to develop a group to do that in the Real News, but we're going to also do that in partnership with Morgan State. For those of you who don't know, Morgan is a historically Black college. Yeah, and so we're having another meeting on the 11th with the communication department. So, we've only been here 2 years, so we're just kind of starting to scratch the surface of what's possible, but that's where we're headed.